Hello, friends. We are back with episode 201 of the R Weekly Highlights podcast. This is the weekly show where we talk about the terrific highlights and other excellent resources that are shared every single week at rweekly.org. My name is Eric Nance, and I'm delighted you join us from wherever you are around the world. And boy, it's been a crazy time in some parts of the world lately, but we're happy you're here. And I'm not joined here alone. I am joined at the hip here virtually by my awesome co-host, Mike Thomas. Mike, how are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty well, Eric. Can't complain. The weather out here on the East Coast, about 20 minutes ago, it was snowing, and now it is sunny and beautiful. So it's as crazy as the world seems to be these days.
It is, and that's no April Fool's a week later. That actually happens, folks, and we had a freeze warning here, too, where it's like, I thought we were done with this, but nope, we are not. So my little hands here are still frigid from being here in the humble basement when I record this. So first world problems, I guess. But nonetheless, we got some stuff to heat up our knowledge here with the batch of highlights we're going to talk about today. And as usual, the R Weekly effort is a volunteer effort where every week we have a new curator rotating into their shift, if you will. And this week that was Jonathan Carroll, again, one of our longtime curators on the project. He's also does a lot of interesting programming exercises, so definitely check out his blog if you're interested in what he's up to. But as always, he had tremendous help from our fellow RWiki team members and contributors like all of you around the world with your pull requests and other terrific suggestions. So if you recall, it was back in 2024, the company Posit, who of course have authored what has become one of the standards in data science tooling with the RStudio IDE. That's also been branded as Posit Workbench for their enterprise products. Well, they made a splash last year when first it was kind of quiet, but then it was a big splash at PositConf when they talked about their new IDE called Positron. And for those that aren't aware, Positron is, in essence, a wrapper around Visual Studio Code, which has been used heavily in software development for quite a few years now, but with a data science flavor to it. And one of the main selling points is that it is a polyglot type of IDE where you can have R, Python, Julia, and almost any other language that Visual Studio Code supports. You can have that right into your Positron session. I have been using Positron almost exclusively for now about 4 or 5 months. It was a little bit here and there in 2024, but with some recent advancements, especially around Nix, I've been able to drive it a lot more as my daily driver, but I'm not the only one. And our first highlight today, we have a great blog post here called Positron, Current Joys and Pains, offered by Athanasia Malenko. She is a neuroscientist, and she gives us a great recap on her experience after 6 months of using Positron. She first leads off with the positives. We always like talking about the good things before the not so good. As I mentioned in the outset, a very, very useful feature of Positron is, like I said, this multiple language support, which doesn't feel like something that was bolted on midway through a product's life cycle. Where if you remember running, say, RStudio in your daily driver and you maybe wanted to do some Python development with it, you would have to use Reticulate. Sometimes it wouldn't feel quite as native. You got a lot of handoffs going on there. But because this is based on Visual Studio Code and it's got access to all of the ecosystem that Visual Studio Code brings, you have either extensions or built-in support for the common languages, especially for data science, such as Python, such as Julia, and others as well. And if you're, say, a JavaScript developer, you can tap into things like ESLint for linting, lots of other extensions. And a new one that came out somewhat recently is the Air extension to help you format your code as you're saving your file, both in R and I believe on the R side of things. But in Positron, these things are easy to set up, and you don't feel like you're going off label, so to speak, when you use these multiple languages. So while I've been mostly doing R with Positron, I definitely have dabbled in Python before in Visual Studio Code. So it shouldn't be any real difference here. As long as you have your Python environment and your R environment set up, you should be good to go with Positron in these multiple languages. Another thing that is growing on me, it took a little bit, but now it's starting to really become nice, is the environment viewer, which now you're starting to see what Positron brings to the table as opposed to just straight Visual Studio Code, is that this environment viewer definitely takes a lot of inspiration from what we saw in the RStudio IDE. Ways so you can view your data set in a rectangular kind of display, do filtering on the spot. It may take a little getting used to at first if you're new to it, but once you get going with it, I think there is a lot of great ways you can explore your data there. Not all perfect. We'll get to that a little later, but I think it's coming along pretty nicely. And one nice thing that coming from those that use RStudio is that there was a viewer pane that you could say run either your Shiny app or maybe the documented report. I knew that would happen. You didn't see it. You could document, you could look at a render report in the viewer and whatnot. But guess what? Anything that the RStudio viewer could do back in RStudio itself, Positron has support for that as well. This means also if you're maybe not on the Quartal train and you're still using a framework like Blogdown, one of my favorite packages for writing a blog with our Markdown, you can actually run your preview of the site in that Positron viewer as well, just like you could with the RStudio IDE. So again, they've done a lot of engineering under the hood to make that pretty seamless. There's also support for the add-ins ecosystem that RStudio brought to the table, again, midway through its life cycle. But because those are basically embedded Shiny apps, when you run those most of the time, you can run those in Positron just as well. However, not all roses and unicorns here. There's still a few things that are troublesome. So, Mike, I hate to make you be the bearer of bad news, but apparently, yeah, debugging's still not quite a seamless experience. What does she have to say about that?
Yeah, in terms of debugging, it's not quite as easy as maybe what you would be used to in VS Code. Running code while you're in the debugger it can be done with Control-Enter. Allows you to run line by line from your browser statement or breakpoint or other debugging marker that you've used. And Athanasia notes that if she's moved the cursor for some reason, whenever she does Control and Enter, it just is stuck at the browser call without running the other code. But if you've moved the cursor manually, it might not work, and she can't really understand exactly why that is the case. I don't know if this is also the experience for any others. Eric, I know you've been a user of Positron a little bit. I don't know how much debugging you've done or if you've sort of ran into the same thing.
Oh, here and there I have. Now, one thing I've kind of had in my muscle memory is I've been using debuggers both in RStudio and in Positron is I'm one of those old school folks that just likes to type in that console to run code and either hit end to do the next line or just print out like an object structure. So, but I can see I've had a little bit here and there where that focus seems to randomly shift away. And then sometimes I have to quit the debugger with capital Q to get back to the normal session and then try again. So there is some finagling you might have to do. So I can see where she's coming from here.
Absolutely. And as well, if your previous workflow like Athanasia's in terms of how to run code when you're in the debugger, I think that's exactly what you're talking about. If you would copy and paste sections of code that you wanted to run into the console and sort of have that interactive experience between the debugger and the console, that's not necessarily going to work in Positron currently. And I think that's sort of the other big frustration that she has at this point right now. However, she says that her experience actually in Positron has helped her better understand the R debugger as a tool and leveraging, the keyboard commands in the debugger like Q to properly exit the debugger, as opposed to maybe doing those things in a point and click fashion when you're in the debugger in RStudio. So I think there's some pros and cons there. In terms of the data viewer, which is how she wraps up this post, it seems like it maps to VS Code's data viewer, if you're familiar with that. So it's pretty good, but I think it lacks a few features that you may be used to if you came from RStudio. First being no handling for labeled data, which she points out is something that Shannon Pileggi feels strongly about, and there's a great link to Shannon Pileggi's blog post on labeling data in R. You can't explore lists in the viewer, where, in RStudio you can expand and collapse nested lists if you click on them from, your global environment. And the data viewer also tries to guess delimiters for plain text files and doesn't always do a great job. So Athanasia has been preferring to use the Rainbow CSV extension, which is, one of the benefits of Positron being built on the open source fork, I believe, of VS Code, which enables use of that open VSX universe of extensions, which is fantastic and something that you wouldn't have had access to as an RStudio user, which is a pretty cool universe for those of us coming from the VS Code world. And then the last thing the blog post wraps up with is being able to sort of set up your Positron environment leveraging a JSON file. And I don't believe that you can do something like this with RStudio. Is it mostly point and click to do that?
They did much later in the life of RStudio give you a way to do a text config file, but it was never, in my opinion, documented very well of how to interact with that directly. You can back it up and then restore it, but this, I admit, what we see here for Positron and by proxy VS Code, yeah, it's JSON, but it makes more sense, I think, to configure it well.
I agree, and it's really nice to be able to do this. It's pretty easy to wrap your head around. It should be familiar for VS Code users, maybe less familiar for RStudio users, but I think taking a couple cracks at it, you'll get used to it really quick.
Yeah, and that's a great phrase to end with. I admit I may have had a jump start in my Positron journey because, Mike, you know this. I was on that whole dev container kick with Visual Studio Code and the R extension with Docker containers. And I was kind of, for my open source work, using VS Code extensively for my development environment. And yeah, I mean, I got a pretty long way in most of my Shiny app workflows especially, but there are always some pain points here and there. So when Positron came to be, it wasn't that huge of a lift, or I should say a shift in perspective, because I've already kind of stress test VS Code a bit. I still can see, if you're coming from RStudio itself, this is going to be a bit of a jump. I think no one will discount that, and that's expected. It will take some getting used to. That's why I always recommend when something new comes out, and let's be honest here, it's still considered beta. It's not a production release yet, although, if we know our history well enough, we'd imagine around September this is going to be a production release, if you know what I mean. But my point being is that try it with some low-risk project, get a feel for it, and then slowly start to morph it into maybe your daily workflow. But the best way to learn is by trying. So I think there's a lot of positive momentum here. Still some paper cuts, as they say. That data viewer aspect without the labeled attributes, that's actually a kind of a bigger one for a lot of my colleagues here in life sciences, because when we import data from SAS, say using the Haven package, we get those labels right off the bat, and to be able to see those in the viewer is a big win for us. So hopefully that comes to play. And I think the other thing that maybe you have to set your expectations for is that this is a very, very customizable experience. Like VS Code, there are all sorts of blog posts out there of people tricking out their setup with various extensions, various pane layouts. In the end, Positron tries to give you like 3 or 4 good choices to start with your pane layout that you can toggle kind of back and forth for the preferences. But I wouldn't get too bogged down into just how much you can customize. I would kind of build it step by step until you get to that state that you like. So I can tell from Athanasia's post here and her post before this, she's been learning along the way. And I think the evolution you can see in her settings file shows just that, with settings for both Positron and some of the popular extensions. Say for Git, there's a Git Lens extension and other nice things with GitHub directly. Speaking of extensions, you may be wondering, well, sure, there's so many out there. Which one should I pick? Well, I will put a link in the show notes to a really handy, what I'll call wrapper extension, authored by Garrick Adenbui over at Posit. I believe it's called Positron X1000 or something to that effect, where it's actually a collection of extensions that he is benefiting from his role as a Shiny developer and an engineer at Posit. You can even just, if you don't install it right away, you could just see what's included in that and see if there's specific ones that meet your needs, whether it's from linting, auto spell checking, navigation layout for your files. There's all sorts of interesting goodies there. So again, easy to get bogged down a little bit, but you've got a lot of choices at your fingertips for how you can tailor the Positron experience to meet your needs in your data science journey. Well, we're at 201, Mike, and the streak continues for yet another interesting highlight involving artificial intelligence in our world of learning and data science. And we're going to hone on that keyword of learning here, because one perspective might be it's one thing to use AI for getting specific help to problems that we're encountering. Maybe it's an error message in our console. Maybe we have to tap into this other language that we rarely use, like XML or whatnot, in our projects. But going back in time, as if you and I had these tools available to us and we're just starting our data science journey, just what would that actually look like? And I think this next highlight here is showing just that, with author by Mine Chechenganaya-Rundell, who is a professor of statistics at Duke University and also on the Posit team, where she is talking about using AI tools for helping learn the Tidyverse. Now, she mentions off the bat, and you're in good company here, Mine, that there are a lot of opinions on AI out there, and we have no shortage of ones that we have here on this very show. But she's going to frame this in the context of being, a newer learner in data science, and maybe trying to do a more common task in, say, R with the Tidyverse to get like a data analysis or visualization done. So there's a few different case studies here that kind of run the full spectrum of what we're talking about here. The first one is leveraging ChatGPT to help with reshaping your data and plotting. So this example is based on an already worked out example from the R for Data Science book, using the Billboard music chart data set, where she's asking the AI, chat bot, use the Billboard data set in the TidyR package to create a visualization of rank versus week number for each song in the data set. And the answer comes back not too shabby. It's loading the packages right off the bat. It's doing a little bit of reshaping with the pivot longer function. That's already a step in the right direction. Doing a little bit of conversion for the week to become numeric, and then doing a ggplot, which you might call a spaghetti plot type setup, where each line is one of these trends and week number on the x-axis and the rank on the y-axis, so that longitudinal profile. And so ChatGPT does give a little explanation at the end. And Mine says, yeah, there's some things that are promising. First, it is using the Tidyverse. It's using a newer version of that TidyR function to go from wide to long with pivot longer. And it's got the y-axis actually being reversed with 0 at the top and 100 at the bottom, which is what she was looking for. But this is where things get tricky, folks. There's always a little bit more than you bargain for here sometimes. Like it colored the lines by track. That, looks kind of interesting from a visual perspective, I guess, as an art piece. Maybe that's not exactly what you were looking for, perhaps. And so it's also loading other packages aren't necessarily involved. Like there's no dplyr used here, right? It's just TidyR and ggplot2. But yet sometimes it just throws this in for about a lot of rhyme or reason. So what you can do, and what a learner might want to do in this case, is they may not know the best way to just not color by track. So they may ask the bot, hey, in a follow-up chat, can you just do this without coloring each line? Sure enough, you get a new plot out of that, and they're all blue now. But they did more than just changing the color, and also changed the alpha level inexplicably from 0.6 to 0.3. So, okay, maybe it just thought that was better when there's no color there. So again, the bot may be making some choices. The AI, chat might make some choices that you don't necessarily agree with. Underscores the importance of reviewing the code as you're seeing this to see if it is really something you want. So there's stuff more at the end of the post we'll get to about kind of practically how do you handle these situations. But again, she's putting herself in the shoes as somebody who's still not quite comfortable with R and say the Tidyverse yet, and trying to get to that more polished answer through additional prompts. In the end, though, some promising trends there. We move on to case study 2, more of a data cleaning exercise, which I think will be very common, a problem to solve for a lot of those using data science in the real world. And she kept this one kind of vague. There was a column in the data set called membership status, where it can be either NA or select to register for a group, but she wants this to, again, instead say closed or open otherwise. So this time she's using Claude to do it. So in this, there's the first response that it gets is a help cleans up the variable, this recoding. But note that if you look at the post after you listen to this, it's using base R to do it, which again, not bad, right? But she wanted Tidyverse approaches. So she asked the prompt, well, can you do this in Tidyverse instead of base R? Then it pivots over to the if_else function, and then to use that in the mutate call with dplyr. Looks fine. We're getting there. But it also does some additional things that maybe because it's been trained on resources that aren't as up to date as what we have now, that kind of raise a few eyebrows. One of which is using the Magrider pipe instead of the base pipe. So again, that can happen, right? When you have data that's trained on this. Some of the styling wasn't quite up to snuff with the line breaks, and it didn't quite show everything correctly. Like it didn't need a head call for that because it's using a Tibble. So little things like that. If you know R well, you know to look for this. But maybe there are better opportunities and additional prompts to make that happen. The last case study is web scraping. This one can get a little messy, right? Because there are multiple ways we can do this, often multiple languages as well. And she kept this prompt really general. She just asked, write code for scraping data from this resource on North Carolina weather data, and this time using Perplexity AI. So she's using different services in each of these to compare and contrast. Well, this should be the surprise of relatively few people. She got an answer right off the bat that was using Python with the beautiful soup library, which often gets talked about in web scraping. So she had to follow up that prompt with, well, use R instead. And then you get some, relatively readable code. It's using the rvest package, which is, again, one of the great packages in the Tidyverse to help with scraping. Pretty utilitarian type code, again, using the Magrider pipe. But there's one thing that it didn't do well. It didn't reshape the data the way that she wanted it. She wanted to have the months as rows and the temperatures as columns. It didn't quite do that the first time. So she asked it to do the reshaping. And then you get a lot of new code to do this, but it's still not quite what she wanted. So she had to try one more time, and she was very explicit this time in the instructions to get 2 tables, one from January to June and then July to December, and then put them all together and then reshape them. And no, this is where things get really dicey. the code that she got back for this step actually doesn't work. It doesn't work. And even though it looks like it worked, but as it gives some output, she has no idea how that output got there because the code actually doesn't work. So that's another red flag, folks. Sometimes it may look correct, but you really got to evaluate this. So this was a fun little journey, Mike. I think you've got a lot of thoughts on this too. As you're seeing these case studies here, what jumps out at you that people should be watching out for as you're seeing this?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest gotchas is the fact that, especially in the last case here with Perplexity, and I've seen it in all the other services as well, both Claude and ChatGPT, which are the two that I have been experimenting with the most. Admittedly, Claude much more so recently than ChatGPT, is that they will pretend that they'll spit out an answer and make it look like the code should run successfully. Right. And that's not necessarily the case here, where in Mel's blog post here, it's the same thing happened. It's spat out the answers, which not only were incorrect, but the code that it's also spat out to give those answers doesn't run. So I think that is going to confuse a lot of new learners. I think it's going to, I was listening to another podcast, shameless plug for the Vanishing Gradients podcast, with Hugo Bown-Anderson, who had Joe Reese on. And, there's this idea that I think we're going to create a ton of technical debt in terms, in the next maybe 5 to 10 years as more AI generated code gets into code bases. And then when something goes wrong, who's going to solve it? Because it looks like these AI solutions are not great at handling the edge cases, right? They're generalizations as it is. And I think that we're not, by having students sort of, lean heavily on these AI tools, they're maybe not learning the fundamentals of programming, which I think is a drawback to, sort of where we're headed in the future. I think it's going to be difficult for folks who are just starting out in their career to get jobs unless they really focus on a lot of these fundamentals. And maybe, the folks like us, Eric, may not have as much work to do, I guess, if we're going to be employing a lot of these AI tools. But when stuff hits the fan, we are going to be extremely highly valued. So, there's that dichotomy there. There's a lot of talk about agentic AI lately, which to my understanding is like stringing these things together in a process. And if one of these is writing poor code that doesn't execute, how can we expect to multiply that concept in a Markov chain type of environment and not have things go wrong? Right? I don't think we've solved for the single agent, if you will, doing a good enough job at, in this case, handling code execution. And maybe it's better in the Python ecosystem or JavaScript or some languages that are much more heavily used depending on your use case. But I think when it gets applied to a lot of business settings, there's just domain knowledge there that the AI application a lot of times will not have to handle those edge cases and to really fit the code to the problem. So I could rant here for the next hour, but I do want to go through sort of the tips and good practices that Mine outlines here at the bottom of the blog post, which I really agree with. First is, provide context and engineer your prompts. And I think we all know this, that the more explicit that you can possibly be and verbose in what you want and maybe how you want the AI to go about doing it, I think the more likely that you're going to get accurate results or results that you were looking for. So that whole concept of prompt engineering, I think, is actually very important. Second, is to check for errors, and it's sort of obvious, but don't just take what comes out of the LLM as gospel. Make sure you run it in your console. Make sure you understand what it's doing. I can't implore, younger data scientists, data analysts in their journey enough to, take a look at what comes back and don't just don't just use it, right? Make sure that you understand all of the parts of it. Go line by line. And if there's something that you're not sure about, take a look at what the LLM gave back, because sometimes they'll not only provide the response, but they will also provide sort of a step-by-step explanation of the code that it gave back and why it used things. Or if you're not 100% sure, ask the LLM why did you include this particular line of code as opposed to doing something different. And I think if you are not taking those steps to do that, I think you're going to be certainly holding yourself back pretty significantly. But if you are, I think it could potentially be just as good of an education and maybe a more streamlined education in a lot of ways compared to, Eric, you and I Googling things. That's the way that we did it, right? For hours and hours on end.
And I still catch myself doing that too. It's amazing how it's still not a first reflex to me to go to the chatbot. Like I'm slowly getting there, but I still catch myself on that Stack Overflow exercise a lot.
Yeah, and then I think we talk about code smell. That's tip number 4 here, and I think that goes back to probably these LLMs being a little bit behind best practices in present day. So it's using the Magritte pipe instead of the base pipe for a lot of cases here, and things like that. Unfortunately, it's hard to make progress when the LLMs are trained on historical data, right? And there's this sort of gap between present best practices and what these AI tools know. So I don't know how exactly we're going to solve that, but it doesn't make me excited or optimistic, I guess, about the ability for us to continue to innovate and make progress at the pace that we currently are. The last couple tips are, potentially starting a new chat if you feel like you are just, continuing to send prompts to your current chat and just not getting exactly what you're looking for. Potentially start fresh and have the LLM sort of ignore all of the prior context that it's perhaps using in your current conversation. Code completion tools, she recommends to use them sparingly if you're a new user, such as GitHub Copilot, and I would certainly echo that sentiment as well. And I think the last tip here is use AI tools for help with getting help, and that's a fantastic idea. I think sort of one of the last sentences here is leverage an AI tool to develop a reprex, maybe that you can share in an issue on GitHub, or that you can share in like the data science learning community Slack channel to be able to get help solving your problem if the LLM is perhaps not doing exactly what you hoped it could do.
Yeah, I really like that feedback there, and it's something that I think the more specific you are in what you're looking for, I think the better off you'll be. And again, it's kind of an art form to get these prompts in a way that get you to that quote unquote right answer more quickly. I don't think I figured it all out yet, but I did get a lot of great advice from many leaders in this space, such as Joe Chang, the author of Shiny, when he was showing me a lot of those AI tools before PositConf last year. It was amazing to see the effort he took in those prompts to get to that, that data viewer application that we saw in his presentation and whatnot. It's going to take practice. Definitely takes a lot of practice, but I really try to. Maybe it's just my nature. I've always been one of those more detail-oriented people. When I tell maybe a resource at the day job what I need to get this task done, and I'm very explicit about here are the input data sets, here are what I'm looking for in the output, here are the key variables I need you to look at. I don't leave anything unturned. My wife will often joke I'm like the menu guy because I always like to go things by a menu so much. Well, I think it can be a good thing in most cases. And I think with prompts, it's better to be specific than to be too general. So that's one thing I've learned over the months or so that I've been using it. And I admit I still am not on the train of code completion yet, even though I've done it a little bit here and there. I was jaded by my first foray of a GitHub Copilot a few years ago, and it was just giving me nonsense for my Shiny app deployments my Shiny app code completion, and I just never really turned it on since. But I got others that seem to be doing better with it, so maybe I just need to have a fresh look at it in 2025. But overall, lots of thoughts that were provoked here with this post, and I think the key part that you and I and Mine likely agree with here is that these can help you, but you still need a fundamental, baseline to help judge what is quality code and to not take it literally the first time around. If you have a careful eye, I think it'd be really helpful. But I've seen too many times already, people are just taking what it's spitting out and running with it at the risk of going into a complete dead end because they didn't know any better. So hopefully over time that becomes solvable, but I won't hold my breath.
Me neither, unfortunately. They can certainly help you, but they can certainly hold you back.
Well, we mentioned at the outset of the episode how products like Positron are really positioning themselves to be a multiple language supported development environment. Well, you can also say the same thing with the Quarto ecosystem, where you have the ability to leverage, languages like R, Python, Julia, and one that I have not used as much until kind of recently, Observable, for interactive JavaScript. And you may be wondering, as an R user, I've heard about this observable thing, either in talks about Quarto or other blog posts, but what does it really mean for me? How do I get started with it? Our last highlight is a terrific way to make this happen. It's called Observable for R Users, and it is a blog post authored by Nicola Rini. She does a terrific job here getting straight to the point of how you can still do both R for parts of your data processing, but then turn to Observable for your visualization needs. So what she starts off with at the post is using R for what it does very well, which is data wrangling. So she's got, based on a previous Tidy Tuesday data set that was used based on the Himalayan mountaineering expeditions. That was from January of this year. She imports that data set into R, does a little bit of cleaning here and there. Not much, really. It's just a little bit of dplyr code for filtering and selecting various columns, and you got yourself a nice rectangular type of data frame. And normally, if I was just staying with R, I might then turn to ggplot2 or one of the extension packages to do the visualization. But now it's time to see what Observable can do for the visualization needs. So in Quarto, just like it was in the predecessor R Markdown, you have your code chunks where you give it the language that's being used for that. So we have used R as a language up to this point in the post. Now we're going to use the OJS code block to start the Observable.js side of it. But the first step, though, is to hand off the data you just processed in R over to Observable. This is the part that seems kind of magical to me. I'm sure it's documented somewhere. But Quarto comes with a function called OJS_define, and you can feed in the object name of that data frame or tibble in R that you created, and then that is going to become available in any code chunk after with Observable. Nonetheless, this is a convenient way now to get the data you wanted from R into Observable. And so what do you do with Observable? There are some things you might need to be aware of for a lot of the plotting libraries, is that sometimes it expects things to be in more of a row-wise format instead of the columnar format that we often see in our data sets in R. So there are functions such as transpose to get you into that row-based format that the visualization function will need later on. So she's got an example of using that with the data that was handed off from R to get that into the row-based layout. When you're in Observable itself comes with a lot of nice built-in libraries for visualization, processing, and whatnot. But what's nice is that you can bring in other JavaScript-based libraries into your Observable session. And this is the other part that seems like magic. In R, we're used to loading a package in your R session via the library function, but that assumes you installed it first, right? Well, in Observable, you can use a function called require, put in the name of that extension library, and it's going to kind of take care of both installing and using it for you. Because now we're in the world of JavaScript, right? These libraries are often externally hosted in some form. And this is kind of like giving you that pointer to that library. So she has an example here where maybe you want to use the D3 library. You could do that and then give it an annotation like a version number afterwards, and you can load that into your session. So that's a nice to have. I've done this before with the Quero library as well. That's kind of like a Tidyverse inspired data processing library in JavaScript. But for the rest of the post, she's going to use what's in Observable itself. One of which libraries is called Observable Plot, which, as the name sounds like, you're going to do yourself a plot with Observable. She starts off with a basic scatter plot with the year on the x-axis and the height of the mountains on the y-axis. And once you have your data in the right format that you do previously, there is a function conveniently called plot. And this is where this kind of resonated with me a little bit with my explorations with Plotly and some other JavaScript libraries. You got to tell the plot what are the variables they're going to use on your plot. And so there's a function or an attribute called marks. And that's where you give it then the data argument, but then what is your x variable and your y variable. You do that, then you got yourself your basic scatter plot right off the bat. But why stop there? Let's make this a little cleaner, shall we? You want to make some adjustments that the x-axis is representing years, but it's like using actual number with comma notation to do it. So we want to transform that into a more logical type of attribute, which would be a date, right? So there are ways that then you can change your data set using, what looks like pretty, Tidyverse-like code, where you can give it a new year, a new variable called p year, and convert that to a date object. So just like R, JavaScript has date objects, numeric objects, character objects and whatnot for your data sets. Then you feed that into your plot, and now you've got at least what looks like a more robust year on the x-axis, and you can give it other nice attributes like using a grid on the back end with a grid true flag, and giving it labels as well with X and Y. There's an attribute called label where you can change the label on that to meet your needs. And then you can get to a color palette where there are built-in color palettes. She has a link to the Observable documentation where if you want to color the points by another variable, you can definitely do that, such as a region. There's a palette she uses called Set2, and you get a nice selection of the different colors. And then last but not least, you can add some titles as well. And again, all these arguments sound pretty logical. It's just a matter of where you fit them. So you have a title, subtitle, and a caption as well if you want to put that at the bottom of the plot, along with tweaking the size and the margins. So you can get very low level with these, but you can get to a pretty basic looking plot that looks pretty nice right off the bat. And Observable, one of the biggest selling points, of course, is the interactivity that'll be built right into your report. If you compile this to Quartal, you might get those tooltips. You might be able to zoom in. Lots of different attributes that you can tap into here. And then if you want, you can save that as a static image afterwards, such as a PNG. You could tap into a package like WebShot in R to grab that from Observable back into R, referencing the output of that cell that was doing the visualization. I've only scratched the surface of what's possible here, and Nicola does a great job of orienting yourself with here's how to get started with it and little teasers along the way to really make this really polished. So I'm intrigued what we can do here, and certainly the handoff from R to the Observable could not be easier in the Quartal ecosystem. What do you think, Mike?
Well, I've done a deep dive, and it looks like we can't, and I'm not sure if you were asking if we can go from Python to OJS, or if you were asking if in Quartal we can go from R to Python data.
It was more the latter, just curious.
I don't think the answer is yes for the latter unless you have reticulate. I think that's what they recommend.
Gotcha.
But you can go from obviously an R data frame to a JavaScript data frame that OJS can consume using that OJS define function. And similarly, on the Python side, you can go from a pandas data frame to, again, using OJS define to an OJS data frame. I have looked beyond that to see if you could do the same with like a polars data frame, but there are no documentation and no links on that. And I can't even find the documentation for if any other Python libraries besides pandas are supported for that particular handoff. But obviously pandas is pretty ubiquitous. Most other Python libraries, even such as polars, have a function to convert that type of a data frame to a pandas data frame pretty quickly if you need to do that handoff. But yeah, this is a fantastic walkthrough. OJS for blog purposes, I absolutely love, for static website purposes, because you don't necessarily need that full server behind the page, but you can still get a lot of the interactivity and the tooltips and things like that OJS defines. And the syntax isn't that bad. Obviously, coming from a different language, it's going to look a little bit different. But if you just sort of take the time, and I think this blog post is a great walkthrough and some really nice snippets of OJS code. It's pretty understandable, pretty legible, pretty consumable, and not too scary. I think if somebody was, trying to recreate these types of plots or trying to use OJS for their own use cases, whether that be a blog post or some other type of dynamic document, I think you'd find it not too difficult of a process to convert from your R and Python, visualization code to OJS code. And I think there are probably some syntaxes here that I might actually prefer OJS to what we have to wrangle on the R and Python side to get the plot to look the way that we want it to look. One pretty cool thing about OJS that I read up on that I did not know is that the documentation on the Observable website has an interactive color palette viewer where you can browse different sequential, diverging, and discrete color palettes. And the built-in options include the color brewer palettes, which we are all very familiar with on the R side. So I thought that was cool. Last night I was, just messing around trying to come up with nice contrast between text and background color on a particular presentation that we are putting together, and didn't really have a great workflow for doing that. I wish I had known about that Observable documentation site.
Yeah, well, I'll link that in the show notes too. And I played with a little bit of visualizations here, but my foray recently with Observable and Quartal was I maintain a website in Quartal for our consortium submissions working group, and I have admittedly a geeky page on there that's meant for authors of the site like me and other contributors, a way to use Observable to dynamically generate the code based on a widget that the user can, or the developer has, of the possible attendees to a working group meeting. There's a little checkbox interface where you can check the names attended it. And then below it, there will be a pre-filled Quartal snippet with one of those call-out blocks that you can expand and contrast with the attendees, with the date that you select, and then you can copy that text into a new Quartal document. It was an over-the-top, yeah, absolutely. But it was a good way to learn nonetheless. So I use that when I start drafting the minutes for that working group meeting, put that developer page up, get the attendees out, and then copy that over to Quartal. But that showed me this connector, which again seemed magical to me, going from R to import a spreadsheet of the possible attendees over to that widget and Observable to reference that on the page itself, and then give you that interactive element to select the names. So there's untapped potential here, and I think in the case where you don't need a server, it's hard to deny the impact that Observable is having, these really clean and polished interactive summaries and visualizations in our Quartal reports. So I think that the time is now to get a little Observable action here. And speaking of which, we had a previous workshop, I believe, at our Pharma a year or two ago, talking about Observable for our users. So I'll put a link to that in the show notes too, if you're interested. And there's a lot more awesome stuff happening in this week's Our Weekly issue. And, of course, we have a link to that full issue in the show notes. running a bit low on time today, so we probably won't do our additional finds, but I'll invite you to check out the excellent issue that Jonathan Carroll has put together for us. Some great highlights or additional finds that if you do want to tap into, I'm already seeing some good stuff about Parquet, DuckDB. You know us, we love soaking up that content, so there's some great data processing content there as well. And if you want to help the project, one of the best ways to do that is to send us that suggestion for that new resource that you found, blog post, new package, anything in the world of data science and R. We love to hear about it. So you can do that via a pull request, linked in the top right corner, that little octocot there right off the bat. Get a link to this week's current or upcoming issue draft. Just send a pull request right there, and our curator of the week will be sure to merge that in. And a little birdie tells me that it might be me this coming week, so I could use all the help I can get, folks. Send those suggestions my way. And also, we love to hear from you on the social medias as well. You can find me on Blue Sky, where I am at our podcast at bsky.social. I'm also on Mastodon, where I'm at our podcast at podcastindex.social. And I'm on LinkedIn. You can search my name, and you'll find me there. And by the time you're listening to this, the 2025 Shiny Conference will be underway, and you'll be able to hear my talk on Friday, talking about the cool stuff I'm doing with Nix and Shiny. But it should be a wonderful conference, so if you're not registered for that, go register now, because there's some great content coming your way there. And Mike, where can the listeners find you?
I couldn't agree more. We are super excited for ShinyConf 2025 over here as well. You can find me on Blue Sky at mike-thomas.bsky.social, or you can find me on LinkedIn by searching Ketchbrook Analytics, KETCHBROOK, to see what we're up to.
Excellent stuff. And again, great to always record a fun episode with you. And right after today, we'll be getting our Shiny Geekdom on at the ShinyConf. And I got to finish my slides, folks. So nothing like conference room development. Okay, then. Well, that's a good time to sign off here. So we'll wrap up episode 201 of the R Weekly Highlights. And we'll be back with another edition of our Weekly Highlights next week.